Baby, baby, how I want you. Before you met someone who set you back on your heels. Goody, goody.
This tall. When he was this tall, he had his first million-dollar love. Why do fools fall in love? Talking about the one, the only, the great rockaway now, Frankie Lymon!
What went wrong with Frankie Lymon? How did a teenage star with the world at his feet end up with such a tragic story? Frankie shot to fame with The Teenagers, wowing audiences with his voice and charm. But how did everything fall apart so quickly? Let's break down Frankie Lymon's rise and heartbreaking fall.
Baby, baby, how I want you.
Frankie Lymon and The Teenagers changed the game for boy bands, and at just 13, Frankie was already stealing the show. Growing up in Harlem, life wasn't easy. His family struggled, and Frankie was working by 11 to help out. He once said, "There was no time to be a kid." By then, he was bagging groceries and even pitching in for rent. But Frankie wasn't just about regular jobs. At 10, he revealed he was earning cash connecting certain locals with some very adult clients, taking a cut for every deal. Definitely not your typical childhood hustle. Still, his heart was set on music. Local hangouts like King Pot were his escape, and he picked up drumming and singing in a church group. Then he spotted a doo-wop group called the Cootaville at a talent show and knew he had to join. After bugging them for months, they let him in. Frankie started as a backup singer, and after some name changes, they became The Teenagers, right as Frankie was about to take center stage. Frankie's mom would always yell, "Frankie, it's 9, get home!" But one day, things changed. Richard Barnett from the Valentines moved nearby, and Frankie and his crew sang for him. To their surprise, he was impressed and took them to G Records for an audition. At first, the label wasn't interested. They were too young. But Frankie's voice won over the owner, George Goldner, who agreed to sign them if Frankie led. Their parents had to sign off, and lawyers set up a deal giving the kids an allowance with the rest saved until they turned 21. Their fresh sound influenced legends like the Jackson 5, but their first hit, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, came after a neighbor handed them a poem. Frankie and Herman Santiago reworked it, and the song blew up, making them stars. Sadly, the group never saw the money they earned.
Baby, baby, how I want you.
Things got messy when Frankie nearly got called out for pretending to have two moms. Here's the drama. While on tour, a reporter who'd met Frankie's mom in New York bumped into another mom in Chicago, and they didn't look anything alike. Frankie had to scramble to convince the reporter it was the same person. Awkward. Meanwhile, Frankie's manager, George Goldner, saw how much everyone loved him and started booking Frankie solo gigs behind the teenagers' backs. This caused major tension within the group, and things hit a breaking point while they were in Europe. Goldner wasn't exactly innocent either. He sold his label to mobster Morris Levy, but not before taking credit for a song Frankie and Herman Santiago had written. To make it worse, Goldner used a random backup group for Frankie's solo track, Miracle in the Rain, but slapped the teenagers' name on it. Naturally, the group was furious. By then, it was clear Frankie was the star. He got all the interviews, attention, and love, while the rest of the group faded into the background. The drama turned into fistfights and tour meltdowns, and by the time they returned to the U.S., it was over. Frankie went solo in 1957, leaving the teenagers to try and fail without him. Their new single flopped, and they faded from the spotlight. Frankie's solo career started strong with hits like My Girl and a spot on the Ed Sullivan Show with Goody Goody. It looked like he was unstoppable, but the truth? Frankie struggled to keep it together without his group, and the teenagers couldn't succeed without him. The magic they had together was gone, leaving both sides stuck in the fallout.
There would be a time in his later years when he would have been able to understand what he was doing and what his worth was, but nobody was going to stop and tell him then. They were too busy taking his money from him. Who's going to tell you what you're worth if they're putting it in their own pockets? You follow me?
Frankie's solo career hung on a little longer, but it never really took off, and honestly, bad choices and shady management didn't help. On the surface, Frankie seemed like this clean-cut, innocent kid, but behind the scenes, things were way darker. By the time Frankie hit the music scene at just 15, he was already hooked on heroin. Yup, 15. It's heartbreaking to think about, but he got introduced to it at a party in New York, surrounded by older musicians who should have known better. Back in the 1950s, heroin was wrecking lives left and right, and unfortunately, Frankie became one of its victims. His addiction didn't just derail his career, it messed up his entire life. It's a tragic reminder of how fast fame and bad influences can take someone down. Things took a dark turn when a woman, almost twice Frankie's age, showed him how to shoot up. At first, he just tried skin popping, basically poking the skin for a lighter high. Frankie admitted he knew it was risky, but thought he had control. "I never meant to get hooked," he later said. "At first, I was fine just doing a little skin pop, but soon I got cocky. It wasn't long before I was injecting it straight into my veins. It was the beginning of a dangerous downward spiral that would haunt him for the rest of his life." Frankie's addiction totally derailed his music career. Once his record sales dropped and people found out about his drug use, the music world basically ghosted him. He went from being a hotshot to a name no one wanted to be linked with. On top of that, his voice started to change as he got older, which made it even harder for him to get work. By 17, he couldn't land gigs anywhere. No booking agents, record labels, or clubs were interested, but that wasn't all. Frankie faced another major curveball. No one knew he was black. Back then, people mainly listened to music on the radio or records. But when Frankie hit national TV for the first time, the audience was shook to see he was black. The network was so freaked out about how people would react. They even hired cops to keep the crowd under control. Frankie, though, stayed calm and handled the awkward situation like a pro. Things hit rock bottom for Frankie in 1957. He was on this TV show, The Big Beat, and during a live broadcast, he danced with a white woman. People in the South lost it. The backlash was so intense, the show got canceled and all the footage was wiped. This scandal made Frankie's career go from bad to worse.
This tall. When he was this tall, he had his first $1 million love. Why do fools fall in love? Talking about the one, the only, the great rockaway now, Frankie Lymon!
By 1960, Frankie tried to kick his drug habit. He had a lot of bad influences around him, but one person really had his back, his road manager, Bob Red Cross. Bob was like a dad to Frankie. He shared stories of other celebs who lost their lives to addiction, and even let Frankie move into his Long Island home to keep him on track. For a while, Frankie seemed to be doing better. He was staying clean, but then a personal tragedy hit him hard. His mom, who had been sick for over a year, passed away. She had terminal cancer, but didn't know how bad it was. The family kept it from her, hoping she'd get better. One of the last things she asked Frankie was if he was staying clean. He promised her, "Mama, don't worry. I'm doing my best. Bob's taking good care of me." But just 4 months later, she was gone. Her death broke Frankie's heart.
He just didn't have the voice. They would have to change the key maybe 5 notes down, and it would sound horrible. So when Frankie did things on TV, he would always lip sync towards the end.
By 18, Frankie was deep in the struggle, turning to drugs to deal with all the chaos in his life. His career was crashing, and he had to lip sync on TV because his live performances were a mess. At 19, he checked into rehab, trying to clean up, but it didn't last. His label dropped him, and for the next few years, he just couldn't shake his heroin addiction, falling back into it every time he tried to get clean. In 1965, Frankie tried to reconnect with the teenagers, but it was a total bust. He bounced around different record labels like 20th Century Fox and Columbia, but nothing clicked. His friends said it was tough to watch him fall so far. He'd always had a bit of an attitude, but now he was just a shell of the guy they once knew. When the gigs dried up, he'd show up at booking agents' offices, practically begging for work, reminding them of his past glory. But most of them just felt sorry for him. His last TV appearance in 1965 showed how bad it had gotten. He looked sick, missing a tooth, with track marks all over his skin. Frankie ended up living on the streets of New York, hitting up old friends for cash just to score drugs, even crashing on subway cars. He looked like a completely different person, hollow-eyed, disheveled, and unrecognizable. Drug dealers saw him as an easy target, following him around backstage whenever he somehow landed a gig. Then in February 1966, he got busted for stealing drums and pawning them to feed his habit. He denied it, but admitted to lying about a lot of other things. Just a few months later, he was arrested again for heroin possession. At this point, Frankie would do anything to keep his addiction going. The guy who once had the world at his feet was now stuck in a nightmare of his own making. It was a heartbreaking fall from grace.
Frankie had fallen.
He was missing a tooth, his skin was in bad shape, and he was forced to have lip sync. It was sad for most of his fans to witness.
Frankie's life took a huge hit when Boris Levy bought the rights to his songs for just $1,500, which later turned into millions, none of which Frankie saw. His personal life wasn't much better. After a tragic loss of their daughter, his marriage to Elizabeth Waters ended, and he moved to LA. There, he reconnected with Zona Taylor, but his drug addiction destroyed their relationship too. In a desperate bid to turn things around, Frankie was given a choice: join the army or go to jail. While stationed in Georgia, he met Mia Eagle, who became his third wife. But his old habits followed him, and he got dishonorably discharged for going AWOL to play bars. Despite everything, Frankie still wanted to make a comeback. He moved to New York with his wife and signed with Big Apple Records, but his past struggles made it tough for promoters to trust him. Months before his death, he told an interviewer, "I know people don't believe I've quit drugs, but I know I have." Sadly, Frankie didn't get the chance to prove it. One day, his brother Lou learned that Frankie had died of a heroin overdose at just 25. Despite all the chaos, Frankie was preparing for a comeback, and by the 80s, 2 other members of the Teenagers had passed away. Years later, Diana Ross helped bring his name back with a cover of Why Do Fools Fall in Love, and in 1993, Frankie and the Teenagers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Frankie also got a star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame.